Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that settles over a battlefield after the fighting ends. It drifts down through the smoke and the ash like something physical, something you could reach out and touch if your hands were not already slick with blood. On 1,000 worlds across the galaxy, that silence carries with it the promise of rest, however brief. The wounded are gathered, the dead are mourned, and the survivors press on, driven forward by duty or desperation or some stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. But on those rare and terrible occasions, when the Orks are the ones left standing amid the wreckage of a battle, the silence does not bring rest. It brings something far worse. It brings the sound of heavy green feet crunching through the rubble, the guttural laughter of creatures that find joy in suffering. And for any space marine unlucky enough to still be breathing when the green tide washes over his position, that silence marks the beginning of a nightmare from which there may be no waking. Tonight, we are going to explore one of the most disturbing and rarely discussed corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We are going to talk about what happens when a space marine, one of the Emperor's finest warriors, a genetically enhanced superhuman clad in the most advanced armor humanity has ever produced, falls into the hands of the Orks. And I want you to understand right from the start that this is not a simple story of death in battle. Death in battle is something every space marine is prepared for from the moment the gene seed takes root in his adolescent body. Death is expected. Death is honored. Death, in many ways, is the point. What we are discussing tonight is something altogether different. We are discussing what happens when death is denied, when the Emperor's mercy does not arrive, when a warrior who was created to know no fear discovers that there are things in the galaxy that make fear feel like a kindness by comparison. The Imperium of man does not like to talk about captured space marines. The very concept runs contrary to everything the Adeptus Astartes represents. These are warriors who have been conditioned since childhood to fight to the last breath, to choose death over surrender, to view capture as the ultimate shame. Their hypno-conditioning, their psycho-indoctrination, their genetic enhancements, all of these things are designed to create a soldier who would rather die on his feet than live on his knees. And yet, the galaxy is vast, and war is unpredictable, and even the mightiest warrior can be brought low by circumstances beyond his control. A bolter can jam at the worst possible moment. A drop pod can land in the wrong coordinates. And a wound can be just severe enough to incapacitate, but not severe enough to kill. And when those moments of terrible misfortune align on a battlefield where the Orks are the enemy, the result is a fate that would make even the most hardened veteran of the Death Watch lose sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, because this is going to be a long journey into one of the darkest and most unsettling aspects of the 41st Millennium. We are going to explore the full scope of what happens to a captured Astartes in Ork hands, from the initial moment of capture through every grim possibility that follows. We will look at the Pain Boys and their horrifying experiments. We will examine the fighting pits where captured warriors are forced to provide entertainment for howling green mobs. We will discuss the Mech Boys and their obsessive desire to loot and repurpose anything that catches their eye, including living prisoners. and we will talk about the profound psychological toll that captivity takes on a being who was literally engineered to be unbreakable. This is not a story for the faint of heart. But then again, neither is the far future of mankind. Let me paint you a picture before we go further. Imagine a world called Carthax Prime, an imperial agri-world in the Segmentum Obscurus, a world of golden wheat fields that stretch to every horizon and fortified granary cities that feed a dozen neighboring systems. Now imagine the sky above Carthax Prime turning dark at midday, not with clouds, but with the shadows of Ork attack ships, dozens of them, hundreds, a flotilla of crude and bellowing spacecraft held together by welded scrap and the sheer stubborn conviction that they can fly. Imagine the first drop pods hitting the wheat fields like iron rain, each one disgorging a mob of howling green-skinned warriors who begin destroying everything in their path with the gleeful enthusiasm of children smashing sandcastles. And imagine, in the middle of this chaos, a squad of space marines from the Celestial Lions chapter, deployed to defend the planet's primary granary complex. They fight with everything they have. Their bolters roar, their chainswords scream, and for a time, the line holds. But the Orks keep coming, wave after wave. An endless green sea that crashes against the defenders with mindless ferocity. One by one, the Marines fall. Brother Kale takes a crude Ork rocket to the chest that blows a hole through his armor and sends him sprawling. Brother Tertius is dragged down by a mob of Orks who overwhelm him through sheer weight of numbers. Sergeant Altheus, the squad leader, fights on alone in the ruins of a grain silo, surrounded by the bodies of dozens of Orks he has killed. Yet until a knob's power claw catches him across the helm and the world goes black. When Altheus wakes, he is in darkness. His armor is gone. His weapons are gone. He can feel the rough texture of Ork iron against his wrists and the hot, fetid breath of something large and green leaning close to his face. And somewhere in the background, behind the grunting and the clanking and the distant sound of Ork laughter, he can hear the screams of other prisoners. Human voices raised in agony that tells him everything he needs to know about what awaits him in the hours and days and weeks to come. This is not a specific account from the lore. It is a composite, a synthesis of everything we know about how these events typically unfold, but it captures the essence of the experience, the sudden and catastrophic transition from warrior to prisoner, from the Emperor's instrument of vengeance to just another piece of loot in the Ork war machine's insatiable appetite for destruction and amusement. Before we can truly understand what happens to a captured space marine, we first need to understand the captors themselves. And understanding the Orks, truly understanding them, requires us to set aside everything we think we know about how intelligent beings are supposed to behave. Or because the Orks do not operate by any set of rules that the human mind finds comfortable. They are not evil in the way that chaos is evil, with its corrupting whispers and seductive promises of power. They are not coldly logical in the way that the Necrons are logical, pursuing their ancient agendas with the precision of machines that have outlived stars. The Orks are something else entirely, something that might actually be worse in its own chaotic and brutally simple way. The Orks are, while at their core, a species that was designed for war. Not adapted for it through millennia of evolution, not driven to it by circumstance or ideology, but literally designed, from the cellular level up, to fight and to kill, and to enjoy doing both more than anything else in the universe. The prevailing theory among Imperial scholars, and it is one supported by a mountain of xenobiological evidence, holds that the Orks were created by the ancient and enigmatic race known as the Old Ones, during a conflict so old that even the Eldar remember it only as myth. These Old Ones, sometimes referred to in Ork legend as the Brain Boys, were master geneticists who created the Orkoid species as a biological weapon system. Every aspect of Ork biology serves this purpose. Their fungal reproductive cycle, which allows a single Ork's spores to generate an entire ecosystem of squigs, snotlings, Gretchen, and eventually full-grown Ork warriors. Their incredible physical resilience, which allows them to survive wounds that would kill a space marine outright, including decapitation followed by having their head sewn onto a different body. Their genetically encoded knowledge, which provides every Ork with an innate understanding of combat, language, and basic technology from the moment they emerge from the ground fully formed. And then there is the Gestalt psychic field that the Orks generate, a phenomenon that Imperial scholars have studied for centuries without fully comprehending. This collective psychic energy, which grows stronger as more Orks gather together, has the remarkable and deeply disturbing ability to make things work simply because the Orks believe they should. A gun that should not fire because it is little more than a pipe welded to a trigger mechanism will discharge lethal rounds in an Ork's hands because the Ork pulling the trigger has absolute faith that it will. Yet a vehicle that should not run because its engine is a jumbled mess of mismatched parts will roar to life because its Ork driver genuinely believes that red ones go faster. This psychic field is not unlimited in its power, but it is pervasive enough to give the Orks a technological capability that far exceeds what their crude craftsmanship should logically allow. It is the reason their ramshackle ships can traverse the void. It is the reason their jury-rigged weapons can punch through power armor. And it is one of the reasons why a captured space marine finds himself in a situation far more dangerous and unpredictable than captivity by almost any other species in the galaxy. Ork society is structured around a single, brutally simple principle. Might makes right. The biggest Ork in any group is the boss, and he stays the boss for exactly as long as no one bigger comes along to take the position from him by force. This hierarchy extends from the lowliest mob of boys all the way up to the mightiest war boss, and it shapes every aspect of how the Orks interact with each other and with the other species they encounter. At the bottom of this hierarchy are the Gretchen, the diminutive and cunning Ork subspecies that serves as a slave class, performing all the menial tasks that Orks themselves cannot be bothered with. Slightly above them, in practical terms, if not in social standing, are the various captured slaves that the Orks accumulate during their conquests, humans, and sometimes even Eldar, who are put to work in the crude industrial operations that keep a war band running. And it is here, in this understanding of Ork hierarchy and the role of slaves within it, that we begin to glimpse the horror that awaits a captured space marine. Because to an Ork, a space marine is not just another prisoner. A space marine is something special, something fascinating. Something that the Orks have encountered on countless battlefields across thousands of years, and something that they have developed a particular and deeply unsettling interest in. Let us pause here and consider something that many people overlook when they think about the Orks. There is a tendency to view the greenskins as stupid, to dismiss them as mindless brutes who succeed only through overwhelming numbers and dumb luck. Yet this is a dangerous misconception that has cost the Imperium dearly on more occasions than its historians care to admit. Orks are not stupid. They are differently intelligent, in ways that human minds find difficult to comprehend. An Ork mech boy can take a pile of scrap metal that a trained Imperial engineer would dismiss as worthless junk and build a functioning weapons system from it, not because he understands the underlying physics, but because he possesses an instinctive, genetically encoded knowledge of how machines work that allows him to bypass the theoretical framework entirely. A pain boy can perform surgery that would require a decade of medical training for a human doctor to attempt, not because he has studied anatomy, but because his hands know what to do, even when his conscious mind does not. This is what makes the Orks so dangerous as captors. They bring an instinctive creativity to their interactions with prisoners that a more rational species would never conceive of. Where a human captor might follow established protocols for the treatment of prisoners, and where an Eldar captor might have specific cultural practices governing the use of captives, an Ork will simply do whatever seems most interesting or entertaining at the time, guided by instincts that have been evolving for millions of years and a psychic field that can make even the most absurd ideas work if enough greenskins believe in them. Orks call Space Marines beakies, a reference to the distinctive shape of certain marks of power armor. And while most Orks are content to simply kill beakies in the heat of battle, relishing the challenge of bringing down such formidable opponents, there are certain members of Ork society who see far more value in a living Astartes than a dead one. And it is these Orks, the pain boys, the mech boys, the ambitious knobs, and the bored war bosses who determine the fate of any space marine unfortunate enough to be taken alive. Now let us talk about how it actually happens. Let us discuss the moment of capture itself, because understanding the circumstances that lead to a space marine falling into Ork hands is essential to understanding why it is such a rare and catastrophic event. Space Marines are not designed to be captured. Everything about them, from their genetic enhancements to their equipment to their tactical doctrine, is built around the concept of either victory or death. A Space Marine's body contains 19 specialized organs derived from gene seed, each one designed to make him faster, stronger, yet tougher, and more resilient than any baseline human. His power armor is a masterwork of Imperial technology, a fully enclosed suit of adamantium and ceramite plates that provides life support, enhanced strength, and protection against everything from small arms fire to the hard vacuum of space. He carries weapons that can tear through armored vehicles and reduce Utsuferkit bunkers to rubble. And he has been trained in every form of warfare known to the Imperium, and from close quarters combat to void boarding actions to full-scale planetary assaults. More than all of this, a Space Marine has been psychologically conditioned to fight to the death. The hypno-indoctrination that every Astartes undergoes during his transformation from human adolescent into superhuman warrior instills a set of mental imperatives that are virtually impossible to override. Surrender is not merely discouraged. It is rendered almost unthinkable by the deep-level conditioning that shapes an Astartes' thought patterns. A space marine who finds himself in a hopeless tactical situation will typically choose to make a last stand, selling his life as dearly as possible while taking as many enemies with him as he can. Failing that, he will attempt to trigger his armor's self-destruct mechanism, denying the enemy any chance of capturing his gene seed or his equipment. And in the most extreme circumstances, an Astartes may employ the ultimate sanction, the mental command that stops his own hearts, allowing him to die on his own terms rather than fall into enemy hands. But the galaxy has a way of circumventing even the most carefully laid plans. And the Orks, for all their apparent stupidity, have an animal cunning that should never be underestimated. There are countless scenarios in which a space marine might find himself incapacitated and unable to either fight or die on his own terms. A massive concussive blast from an Ork shock attack gun might scramble his neural pathways, leaving him alive but temporarily unable to process commands, including the command to stop his own hearts. A lucky hit from a crude but powerful Ork weapon might sever his spine or destroy his catalepsian node, the implant that allows him to remain conscious even while parts of his brain shut down. He might be buried under tons of rubble after an Ork gargant's foot crushes the building he was using for cover, trapped and immobilized, but still breathing thanks to his enhanced physiology and his armor's life support systems. Or perhaps the most common scenario of all, he might simply be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Orks are, in all probability, the most numerous species in the galaxy. Yet a typical Ork assault does not come in the form of carefully coordinated fire teams advancing under cover. It comes as a screaming green avalanche of bodies, hundreds or thousands of Orks charging forward in a massive horde, their enthusiasm for close combat so great that they will happily absorb horrific casualties just for the chance to get stuck in. Against such a tide, even a space marine can be dragged down. His bolter runs dry, his chainsword's teeth clog with green flesh, yet his armor's servo motors strain under the weight of dozens of Orks trying to pull him apart. And then a heavy blow catches him on the side of the helm, or a crude power claw clamps down on his leg, or a knob's headbutt cracks his faceplate, and the world goes dark. When consciousness returns, if it returns at all, the Space Marine finds himself in a situation that no amount of training could have prepared him for. His armor has been partially or completely removed, stripped from his body by Ork mech boys, eager to get at the strange and fascinating technology hidden within its ceramite shell. His weapons are gone, claimed as trophies by whichever Ork managed to pry them from his enhanced grip. And he is surrounded by creatures that view him not as an enemy to be respected or a prisoner to be interrogated, but as something between a curiosity, a toy, and a piece of raw material to be used however their crude imaginations dictate. And this brings us to what is perhaps the most universally dreaded fate that awaits a captured space marine in Ork society: the attention of the Pain Boys. Ork Pain Boys, also known as Mad Docs or simply Docs, are the closest thing that Ork society has to medical practitioners, though comparing them to any human doctor would be both inaccurate and deeply insulting to the medical profession. Pain Boys are a class of Ork Oddboy, which means they are born with genetically encoded knowledge of their particular specialty. In this case, surgery, and biological experimentation. But the key word there is orc. An orc pain boy's understanding of medicine operates on approximately a 19th century level of surgical knowledge, except with none of the ethical constraints and all of the enthusiasm of a child given unrestricted access to a set of power tools. The chief passions of pain boys are surgery and extreme dentistry. Teeth, or teeth, as the orcs call them, serve as the primary currency in orc society, which means that a visit to the pain boy for medical treatment often involves having several perfectly good teeth extracted as payment, while the patient is already strapped down and unable to object. This is actually one of the more benign things that can happen during an appointment with a doc. The truly terrifying aspect of pain boys is their insatiable appetite for experimentation. Yet every pain boy's greatest joy is conducting what they call experiments, and they pursue this passion with a manic enthusiasm that makes the most radical magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus look positively restrained by comparison. For a captured space marine, the pain boy represents a convergence of every possible kind of horror. Because a space marine is not just another captive to be poked and prodded, a space marine is a masterwork of biological engineering, and a body that has been enhanced with 19 specialized organs that no orc has ever seen before, created from gene seed that represents the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic science. To a pain boy, a captured Astartes is the single most interesting patient he has ever had the opportunity to examine. And examine he will, with the thoroughness that only a being utterly devoid of empathy and armed with a collection of sharp, crude instruments can achieve. The Lexicanum records tell us that some particularly ambitious pain bosses, which are the highest-ranking pain boys, have actively attempted to capture space marines specifically so they could unlock the secrets of their gene seed and produce a strain of even hardier orcs. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that implies. An orc surgeon, operating with crude instruments and an instinctive but fundamentally imprecise understanding of biology, attempting to reverse engineer the Emperor's own genetic masterwork by taking apart a living space marine piece by piece. The procedures would be conducted without anesthetic because pain boys do not believe in anesthetic. The concept of patient comfort is entirely alien to them. They keep their patients conscious during surgery not out of any medical necessity, but because the screams serve as a useful indicator that the patient is still alive. And because many pain boys find the reactions of their subjects to be genuinely amusing, the experiments themselves would range from the horrific to the bizarre. A pain boy might attempt to transplant Astartes organs into an orc body, not understanding that these organs were designed to work in concert with specific human genetics and would reject the orc physiology violently. He might try to graft orc bionics onto the space marine's body, such replacing functioning limbs and organs with crude mechanical substitutes just to see what happens. He might attempt a head transplant, swapping the marine's head onto a different body, a procedure that orcs themselves can survive thanks to their incredible resilience, but that would almost certainly be fatal to a human-derived being. Or he might simply vivisect the marine with methodical thoroughness, cataloging each organ and tissue sample in his own primitive way, all while the subject remains conscious and fully aware of what is being done to him. And remember, a Space Marine's enhanced physiology works against him in this situation. His Laraman's organ, which creates super platelets that cause wounds to clot rapidly, means that even grievous surgical injuries will not cause him to bleed out as quickly as a normal human would. His secondary heart provides a backup circulatory system that keeps him alive even when his primary heart is compromised. Yet his Susan membrane allows him to enter a state of suspended animation when mortally wounded, but a skilled pain boy, or even an unskilled one who gets lucky, might figure out how to prevent this, keeping the Marine conscious and responsive throughout procedures that would kill a baseline human 10 times over. The very enhancements that were designed to keep a Space Marine fighting on the battlefield become instruments of prolonged suffering on the Pain Boy's operating table. The duration of these experiments can vary wildly. Some Pain Boys have the attention span of a particularly excitable child, and their interest in a specific subject might wane after a few hours of prodding, at which point the Marine might be discarded, killed outright, or passed on to another Ork who has expressed an interest. Other Pain Boys, particularly the more senior Pain Bosses, have developed something approaching patience, and might keep a Space Marine alive and conscious for days, weeks, or even longer, returning to their subject periodically to conduct new procedures or check on the results of previous ones. The lore tells us that Pain Bosses have been known to lead entire war crusades, specifically in search of new and interesting specimens to experiment upon, which gives you some sense of how deeply this drive for experimentation runs in their psyche. But the Pain Boys table is not the only destination for a captured Astartes. There are other fates, equally grim, that await those Space Marines who are deemed more useful alive and intact than they are as experimental subjects. The Orks love fighting. This is not an exaggeration or a simplification. It is the fundamental truth of their existence. Fighting is not something Orks do because they have to, or because they are ordered to, or because they have some grand strategic objective in mind. Fighting is what Orks live for. It is their religion, their recreation, their art, their philosophy, and everything in Ork society ultimately serves the purpose of enabling more fighting, bigger fighting, better fighting. And when the fighting on the battlefield ends, the Orks do not simply sit around waiting for the next war to start. They create opportunities for combat wherever and however they can. This is where the fighting pits come in. Almost every Ork settlement of any significant size features some form of arena or fighting pit, and a cleared space surrounded by howling spectators, where various combatants are thrown together for the entertainment of the mob. These pits serve multiple purposes in Ork society. They provide entertainment during the long periods between major campaigns. They serve as a way for disputes between Orks to be settled without disrupting the broader social order. They are a venue for Orks to prove their combat prowess and rise in the brutal hierarchy of green-skin society. And they are a place where captured prisoners, including the rare and prized Space Marine, can be forced to fight for the amusement of their captors. For a Space Marine, being thrown into a fighting pit is a particular kind of torment. It is not just the physical danger, although that is considerable. Stripped of his armor and his weapons, a Space Marine is still a formidable combatant, stronger and faster than any baseline human, and possessed of centuries of combat training. but he is also significantly smaller and weaker than a fully grown orc, especially the knobs and war bosses, who typically serve as opponents in the more prestigious fighting pits. An orc knob stands considerably taller than a space marine, and a war boss can be truly enormous, towering over even a Terminator-armored Astartes. Without his power armor to augment his strength and protect him from harm, a space marine fighting an orc knob in hand-to-hand combat is at a significant physical disadvantage. But the true horror of the fighting pits goes beyond the mere physical contest. It is the purpose behind the fighting that makes it so deeply offensive to everything a space marine represents. An Astartes is trained to fight for a reason, to defend the Imperium, to protect humanity, to carry out the Emperor's will. Every battle has meaning, every engagement serves a strategic purpose, every life taken is part of a larger struggle for the survival of the human species. In the fighting pits, none of that exists. A captured space marine is forced to kill not for any noble purpose, but for the entertainment of Xenos creatures who regard the spectacle of combat as the highest form of amusement. His fighting skills, honed over decades or centuries of training and warfare, are reduced to a sideshow act, a novelty to be howled and cheered at by a mob of bloodthirsty greenskins who care nothing for honor or duty or sacrifice. Worse still, a captured space marine in the fighting pits might be forced to fight against other prisoners, including fellow humans. The Orks regularly capture soldiers from the Imperial Guard, hive world civilians, and other human populations during their rampages across Imperial space. These captives are often thrown into the pits as well, and the Orks take particular delight in forcing prisoners from the same side to fight each other to the death. For a space marine, whose entire existence is dedicated to protecting humanity, being forced to kill innocent Imperial citizens for the amusement of Xenos is a psychological wound that cuts deeper than any blade. It strikes at the very core of his identity, the very reason for his existence. The fighting pits also serve as a kind of evaluation system for the Orks. Those prisoners who prove themselves capable fighters may be kept alive longer, given better food, perhaps even treated with a crude form of respect by their captors. But this is not mercy, it is investment. A prisoner who fights well in the pits earns more teeth for his owners when other Orks bet on the outcomes. He becomes a commodity, a source of income and entertainment that is worth maintaining in reasonable fighting condition. This means that a space marine who survives the pits might find himself trapped in an indefinite cycle of combat and recovery, fighting bout after bout against increasingly dangerous opponents, never knowing when his next fight will be his last. Some accounts from recovered Imperial prisoners suggest that certain Ork warbands have maintained fighting pits for decades, with a rotating cast of prisoners constantly being replenished as old fighters are killed and new captives are brought in. The most successful fighters, those who survive long enough to become recognized by the Ork spectators, and sometimes develop almost a celebrity status among their captors, which brings with it its own particular set of horrors. A famous fighter cannot be allowed to die, because his death would deprive the Orks of their entertainment. So he is kept alive through increasingly extreme measures, including visits to the pain boy for repairs after particularly brutal bouts, which loops back to the nightmare of orc medicine and all the additional suffering that entails. Yet there is another dimension to the fighting pits that bears mentioning, and it has to do with the way orcs perceive combat itself. For a human being, even a space marine, combat is a means to an end. You fight to achieve an objective, to defend a position, to destroy an enemy, to survive. The violence is instrumental, serving a purpose beyond itself. But for an orc, combat is the end in itself. The fight is not a means to achieve something else. The fight is the point, the joy of battle, the thrill of crushing an opponent, the visceral satisfaction of a well-landed blow. These are the things that make life worth living for an orc. This fundamental difference in the perception of violence means that a captured space marine in the fighting pits is not just being used. He is being drawn into a worldview that is completely alien to everything he has been taught, a worldview where his martial skills have no meaning beyond the entertainment they provide, where his victories earn him not honor, but only the guarantee of more fighting, and where his eventual death will be greeted not with mourning or respect, but with roaring disappointment that the show is over. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Every space marine carries within him a sense of purpose that has been carefully cultivated from the moment he began his transformation from human adolescent to transhuman warrior. But that sense of purpose is the bedrock upon which his entire psychological architecture is built. Strip it away, replace it with the empty spectacle of the fighting pit, and you begin to erode the foundations of the Astartes' identity in ways that no amount of physical punishment could achieve. A space marine can endure pain. He can endure injury. He can endure the most extreme forms of physical deprivation. But can he endure the slow, grinding realization that his fighting skills, the skills that define who he is and give meaning to his existence, have been reduced to nothing more than entertainment for creatures that cannot even comprehend what they are destroying? The fighting pits also expose captured Marines to something they rarely encounter on the battlefield: prolonged, face-to-face interaction with ordinary human beings in a context of shared suffering. On the battlefield, other Space Marines are figures of awe and reverence to the common soldiers of the Imperial Guard and the civilians of the worlds they defend. They are angels of death, demigods in ceramite armor, beings so far removed from ordinary humanity that most mortals can barely look upon them without trembling. In the fighting pits, all of that is stripped away. A space marine standing in the mud and the blood of an orc arena, stripped of his armor and his weapons, is still physically imposing. He's still clearly more than human, but he is also clearly just as much a prisoner as the terrified guardsman standing next to him. This forced equality, this shared helplessness in the face of orc brutality, creates connections and emotional bonds that the Astartes conditioning was never designed to handle. A space marine might find himself developing attachments to fellow prisoners, feeling protective of humans he would normally regard with distant benevolence, and experiencing grief when those humans inevitably fall in combat or are dragged away by their captors for other purposes. These emotions are not necessarily destructive, but they are unfamiliar and disorienting, and they add another layer of psychological complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Then there are the mech boys, and the particular form of living horror that they can inflict upon a captured space marine. If the pain boy represents the terror of the biological, and the mech boy represents the terror of the mechanical, because mech boys do not just build machines, they build anything and everything that catches their eye, using whatever materials happen to be available. And a captured space marine, with his genetically enhanced body and his sophisticated suit of power armor, represents a treasure trove of materials and components that no self-respecting mech can resist. Orks are natural looters. This is one of the fundamental truths of their species, and anything that is not nailed down will be looted, and most things that are nailed down will simply be pried loose and looted anyway. After a battle, Ork mech boys will swarm across the field collecting everything of value, from functional weapons and vehicles to random scraps of metal and circuitry that might prove useful later. Space Marine equipment is particularly prized because of its quality and durability. A suit of power armor, even a damaged one, contains ceramite plating, adamantium components, powered servo motors, auto senses, and a compact fusion reactor that are all vastly superior to anything the Orks can produce on their own. The Lexicanum specifically records the existence of looted Umier power armor, which is power armor stripped from the bodies of space marines and repurposed for use by Orks. But Ork mech boys do not always wait for a space marine to be dead before they start the looting process. A living space marine is, in many ways, more interesting to a mech than a dead one, because a living subject allows the mech to study how the armor interfaces with its wearer, how the black carapace implant that every Astartes possesses connects the Marine's nervous system to his suit's control systems, and how the various subsystems of the armor respond to commands from the wearer's brain. This kind of information is incredibly valuable to a mech who is interested in improving Ork technology, particularly the construction of mega armor, those ponderous and incredibly powerful suits of powered armor that are worn by the wealthiest and most elite Ork knobs, the mega knobs. For the captured space marine, this means being subjected to a different kind of experimentation than what the pain boy offers. Where the pain boy is interested in flesh and bone and organ, the mech is interested in the interface between flesh and machine. He might attempt to remove the marine's black carapace, the subcutaneous membrane that connects a space marine to his power armor, to study how it functions and whether something similar could be adapted for Ork use. He might try to reverse engineer the marine's bolt pistol or chainsword, taking the weapon apart piece by piece, while the former owner watches helplessly. He might even attempt to incorporate the space marine himself into one of his creations, outwiring the Astartes' neural systems into a vehicle or a weapon system in a crude parody of the dreadnought internment process, using the marine's brain as a biological control unit for some ramshackle Ork war machine. The concept of the cyborg, an Ork that has been extensively modified with mechanical bionics by a mech boy, is well established in Ork society. Orks can accept crude bionic enhancements, transplants, and other mechanical augmentations with remarkable ease thanks to their resilient physiology. Some cyborgs are barely recognizable as organic beings anymore, their bodies replaced piece by piece with mechanical components until they are essentially robots with an Ork brain. Now imagine that same process applied to a space marine. Imagine an Astartes whose limbs have been replaced with crude Ork bionics, whose eyes have been swapped out for primitive optical sensors, whose nervous system has been wired into a patchwork of Ork circuitry and salvaged Imperial technology. He would be a grotesque fusion of two incompatible technologies, his body slowly failing as it rejected the crude Ork implants, while the mech cheerfully welded more modifications onto his suffering frame. This is not merely speculation. The lore tells us that pain boys regularly transform captured prisoners into horrifying cybernetic monstrosities. And there is no reason to believe that Space Marines would be exempt from this treatment. If anything, the enhanced physiology of an Astartes would make him a more attractive candidate for such modification, because his body's natural resilience would allow him to survive procedures that would kill a baseline human, and his superior cognitive function would make him a more capable component in whatever machine the mech decided to build around him. Yet there is another aspect of the mech boy's interest in captured Space Marines that deserves attention, and it has to do with the broader Ork approach to technology. Orks are, as we have discussed, instinctive engineers who build things based on genetic memory and intuition rather than learned knowledge. But this instinct is not static. It evolves and adapts based on what the Orks encounter. When a mech boy gets his hands on a piece of Imperial technology, even if he does not understand how it works in the theoretical sense, his instinct allows him to reverse engineer its function and incorporate its principles into his own creations. This is how Ork technology advances, not through research and development in the Imperial sense, but through a process of aggressive acquisition and instinctive adaptation. A captured Space Marine represents a walking library of Imperial technology. His armor alone contains systems that a mech boy could spend months studying and adapting. The autosenses, which provide enhanced visual, auditory, and environmental data to the wearer. The power plant, a compact fusion reactor that provides seemingly limitless energy. The servo motors, which amplify the wearer's strength to superhuman levels. The communications systems, the life support systems, the medical monitoring systems. Each one is a potential source of inspiration for an Ork mech, a blueprint that his instinct can interpret and translate into something that works within the Ork technological framework. But the Marine himself is potentially even more valuable than his armor. The black carapace, the subcutaneous neural interface that connects a Space Marine to his armor, represents a technology that the Orks have been trying to replicate for centuries. The closest they have come is the crude neural interfaces used in kilicons and def dreads, the Ork equivalents of dreadnoughts, where a critically injured Ork, or sometimes a particularly unfortunate Gretchen, is wired into a walking combat machine. But these interfaces are primitive and unreliable, often leaving the pilot in constant pain or driving him slowly insane. A mech boy who could study a functioning black carapace in a living subject might be able to improve Ork neural interface technology significantly, which would have implications not just for individual Ork war machines, but for the entire Ork approach to mechanized warfare. The process of studying and adapting Imperial technology from a captured Marine also intersects with the Ork Gestalt psychic field in ways that are difficult to predict and potentially very dangerous. If a mech boy believes, really genuinely believes, that he can make a captured piece of Space Marine technology work in an Ork context, The psychic field will provide a boost to his efforts. This means that even if the theoretical basis for the adaptation is completely wrong, the practical result might still work, at least partially, at least some of the time. And in Ork technology, some of the time is usually considered good enough to put into production. The implications of this are deeply concerning for the Imperium. Every piece of Space Marine technology that falls into Ork hands, whether from a dead Marine on the battlefield or a living captive in a mech boy's workshop, represents a potential advancement in Ork technological capability. And because the Orks reproduce their technology through instinct rather than documentation, any advancement that one mech boy achieves can potentially spread to others through the Gestalt psychic field, gradually elevating the technological baseline of the entire Ork species. This is a slow process, thankfully. And the Orks' inherent chaos and lack of quality control mean that most technological innovations are lost as quickly as they are gained. But the potential is always there, lurking beneath the surface of Ork society like a dormant virus, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to trigger an evolutionary leap. Beyond the specific horrors of the Pain Boy's table, the fighting pits, and the mech boy's workshop, there is the more general fate of slavery that awaits many captured prisoners in Ork society. And while slavery might seem like a lesser horror compared to vivisection or forced cybernetic conversion, the reality of life as an Ork slave is its own particular kind of hell. Ork society requires labor. Despite their fearsome reputation as warriors, the Orks need someone to do the mundane work that keeps their warband functioning. Someone has to dig the trenches. Someone has to load ammunition. Someone has to work the crude forges where Ork weapons and armor are produced. Someone has to maintain the vehicles and starships that carry the green tide from world to world. The Gretchen handle much of this labor, but on worlds that the Orks have conquered and occupied for any significant period, captured humans are also put to work alongside the smaller Orkoid species. The Runthirds, those specialized Ork oddboys who manage the Gretchen slave populations, also oversee human captives, yet using the same brutal methods of control. Whips, electrified prods, and the ever-present threat of being fed to the squighounds are the standard tools of Ork slave management. For a space marine reduced to slavery, the degradation goes beyond mere physical suffering. Every Astartes has been psycho-indoctrinated with a deep sense of purpose and identity. He is a warrior of the Emperor, a defender of humanity, and a member of an elite brotherhood that traces its lineage back to the Primarchs themselves. To be reduced to the status of a slave, forced to perform menial labor for the very Xenos he was created to destroy, is an assault on his identity so profound that it can damage even the formidable psychological conditioning that shapes an Astartes' mind. The Orks do not understand this, of course, yet they do not grasp the significance of what they are doing when they chain a space marine to a rock crusher or force him to carry ammunition crates. To the Orks, a slave is a slave, regardless of how fancy his genetics might be. A space marine is simply a bigger, stronger slave who can do more work and last longer before he breaks down. The irony is bitter and absolute. A warrior who was created to embody the might and majesty of the Emperor of mankind and reduced to the same status as the lowliest Gretchen, bullied and beaten by creatures that barely rise above the level of animals in their intellectual sophistication. Some accounts from Imperial intelligence suggest that certain Ork warbands make use of captured Space Marine slaves in particularly insidious ways. The Blood Axe clan, which has the most extensive history of interaction with the Imperium of man, has been known to use captured humans, including occasionally Astartes, as intermediaries in their dealings with Imperial forces. Blood Axes are unique among the Ork clans in their willingness to engage in trade and even limited cooperation with human populations, and they have been known to employ captured prisoners as translators, negotiators, and even as cannon fodder in campaigns where the Blood Axes are fighting alongside Imperial forces against a common enemy. For a Space Marine forced into this role, the horror is compounded by the knowledge that his own people might not even realize he is alive, might assume he died in battle and received the Emperor's peace, while in reality he is being paraded before them as a trophy and a tool of his captors. The lore also records instances where Orks have used captured humans and potentially captured Space Marines as food. This is not a widespread practice, and it tends to occur primarily when an Ork warband finds itself short of other food sources. But the Imperial records are clear that Orks do eat human prisoners, sometimes cooking them first, and sometimes not bothering with the formality. During the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, the Orks were documented breeding captive human populations as livestock, maintaining them in conditions that would make the darkest slave camps of any human civilization look humane by comparison. While there is no specific record of Space Marines being consumed in this way, the possibility cannot be entirely discounted, particularly given that an Astartes body contains significantly more meat than a baseline human. Now let us talk about the psychological dimension of captivity, because this is an aspect that is often overlooked in discussions of what happens to captured Space Marines. There is a tendency, when discussing the Adeptus Astartes, to focus exclusively on their physical capabilities and their martial prowess, yet as though they were simply very efficient fighting machines, wrapped in very good armor. But Space Marines are not machines. They are human beings, or at least they were human beings before the gene seed transformed them into something more. And despite their extensive psychological conditioning, despite the hypno-indoctrination and the psycho-conditioning and the centuries of combat experience, Space Marines remain capable of suffering in ways that go far beyond the merely physical. When a Space Marine's psycho-indoctrination is designed to make him resistant to fear, despair, and other emotions that might impair his effectiveness in combat. The famous declaration that "they shall know no fear" is not merely a motto. It is a literal description of the mental state that the conditioning is designed to produce. But resistance is not immunity, and the conditions of Ork captivity are designed, however inadvertently, to attack an Astartes' psychological defenses from angles that his conditioning was never intended to address. Consider the isolation. A Space Marine is a creature of brotherhood. From the moment he enters the chapter as a young initiate, he is surrounded by his battle brothers, warriors who share his experiences, his values, his genetic heritage, and his sense of purpose. This brotherhood is not merely a social bond. It is a fundamental component of the Astartes' psychological architecture. Wide a support structure that reinforces the conditioning and provides the emotional context within which a space marine processes his experiences. Remove that brotherhood, and the conditioning begins to operate in a vacuum without the external reinforcement it was designed to receive. A captured space marine, cut off from his chapter and his battle brothers, is a warrior fighting on two fronts simultaneously, against his captors and against the slow erosion of his own psychological foundations. We consider also the powerlessness. Space Marines are accustomed to being the most dangerous beings on any battlefield. They are used to the feeling of power that comes from wearing the finest armor, wielding the deadliest weapons, and possessing the physical capabilities that set them apart from ordinary mortals. In captivity, all of that is stripped away. A space marine without his armor is still formidable, but he is also vulnerable in ways that he may not have experienced since his days as an aspirant. The sensation of being physically overpowered, of being unable to defend himself or fight back effectively, is profoundly disorienting for a being whose entire identity is built around martial superiority. And consider the duration. Time moves differently in Ork captivity than it does on the battlefield. On the battlefield, events happen quickly. Decisions are made in fractions of a second, and the adrenaline of combat compresses the perception of time so that hours feel like minutes. In captivity, the opposite is true. Hours feel like days. Days feel like weeks. The monotony of imprisonment, broken only by episodes of violence and suffering, creates a temporal distortion that slowly grinds away at even the strongest will. A space marine who might have faced 100 battles without flinching can find himself struggling to maintain his composure after weeks or months of captivity. Yet not because the suffering is more intense than what he has experienced in combat, but because it is relentless, unending, and utterly devoid of the meaning that combat provides. The hypno-conditioning includes certain safeguards against exactly this kind of psychological deterioration. The catalepsian node, one of the 19 gene seed organs, allows a space marine to consciously shut down portions of his brain, entering a state of partial sleep while remaining alert and responsive. While this ability can be used to endure prolonged periods of stress by allowing the Marine to rest parts of his mind while keeping others active. The conditioning also includes mental exercises, meditative techniques, and prayer rituals that are designed to help an Astartes maintain his psychological equilibrium in adverse conditions. But these safeguards have limits, and Ork captivity has a way of finding and exploiting those limits with brutal efficiency. The constant noise and chaos of an Ork encampment makes it difficult to maintain the concentration needed for meditation or prayer. The unpredictable schedule of violence, where a beating or an experimental procedure or a bout in the fighting pit can come at any time without warning, prevents the Marine from entering the deep restorative states that his catalepsian node makes possible. And the sheer alienness of his situation, the fact that he is surrounded by creatures whose psychology, what culture and biology are fundamentally incompatible with his own, creates a sense of cognitive dissonance that his conditioning was never designed to address. Over time, even the most resilient space marine will begin to show the effects of this kind of sustained psychological assault. He may become withdrawn, retreating into the deepest recesses of his mind, in an attempt to shield himself from the horror of his situation. He may become aggressive, lashing out at his captors at every opportunity in a desperate attempt to reassert some measure of control over his circumstances, even if such behavior only results in more punishment. Or he may begin to adopt the most terrifying coping mechanism of all, a cold mechanical acceptance of his situation that mirrors the emotional numbness that the lore describes in long-interred dreadnought pilots. Yet a space marine who has been in Ork captivity long enough may eventually stop resisting, not because he has been broken, but because the part of him that was capable of caring about his own fate has simply been worn away by the relentless grinding of time and suffering. This brings us to the question that inevitably arises when discussing captured space marines. What happens when the Imperium finds out? How does the Adeptus Astartes respond when one of their own falls into enemy hands? And the answer is complicated and depends heavily on the specific chapter, the circumstances of the capture, and the resources available for a rescue operation. Some chapters, particularly those with a strong emphasis on brotherhood and honor, will move heaven and earth to recover a fallen brother. The Space Wolves, with their fierce loyalty to their packmates, are notorious for launching seemingly suicidal rescue missions when one of their own goes missing. The Salamanders, whose ethos of self-sacrifice and protection of the innocent extends to their own battle brothers, would consider it unthinkable to abandon a captured Marine without at least attempting a rescue. Even the more pragmatic chapters, like the Ultramarines, will typically make some effort to recover captured Astartes, though they are more likely to weigh the costs and risks of a rescue mission against the potential benefits. But there is a darker side to the Imperium's response to captured space marines that must be acknowledged. For many chapters, the loss of the gene seed that a captured marine carries within his progenoid glands is actually a greater concern than the fate of the marine himself. Each space marine carries 2 progenoid glands, the 18th of the 19 gene seed organs, which contain the genetic material needed to create the next generation of Astartes. These progenoid glands mature over a period of 5 to 10 years after implantation, and when they are harvested, each one contains enough genetic material to create one new set of gene seed organs. This means that every fallen space marine whose progenoid glands are not recovered represents not just the loss of one warrior, but the potential loss of 2 future warriors. The recovery of gene seed from fallen space marines is such a critical priority that every Astartes apothecary carries a specialized tool called a reductor, which is designed specifically for the rapid extraction of progenoid glands from dead or dying marines on the battlefield. When a space marine falls in combat, the apothecary's first priority is not to save the wounded marine or recover his body, but to extract his gene seed before it can be lost. Yet this cold calculus of genetic preservation means that in some cases, a rescue mission to recover a captured space marine might be motivated less by concern for the marine's welfare and more by concern for the gene seed he carries. In the worst-case scenario, if a rescue mission is deemed impossible or too costly, a chapter might instead opt for what is euphemistically known as a mercy strike, a targeted attack designed not to rescue the captured marine, but to ensure his death and the destruction of his gene seed before either can be exploited by the enemy. This is particularly likely if there is reason to believe that the Orks' pain boys are actively experimenting on the captured Marine's gene seed, because the possibility of Orks somehow using Astartes' genetic material to enhance their own species is a nightmare scenario that the Imperium will go to almost any length to prevent. And then there is the possibility that a captured space marine might engineer his own escape. This is rare, but not unheard of. And Astartes is a formidable combatant even without his armor and weapons, and his enhanced senses, superior physical capabilities, and tactical training give him advantages that even Ork captivity cannot entirely negate. A space marine who retains the use of his limbs and his cognitive faculties can bide his time, study the patterns and weaknesses of his captors, and wait for the right moment to make his move. Ork security, such as it is, tends to be haphazard and easily distracted, because the Orks themselves cannot conceive of a prisoner being genuinely dangerous to them. This overconfidence can create opportunities that a patient and resourceful Astartes can exploit. But escape from an Ork warband is only the beginning of the survivor's ordeal. A space marine who manages to break free of his captors must then navigate through hostile territory, potentially on an Ork-occupied world, without armor, weapons, or reliable means of communication. He must evade patrols, find food and water to sustain his enhanced metabolism, and somehow make contact with Imperial forces who may not even be looking for him. And even if he manages all of this, even if he makes it back to his chapter alive and relatively intact, his troubles are far from over. The practical challenges of escape are worth examining in some detail because they illustrate just how thoroughly a captured space marine's advantages can be negated by his circumstances. Without his armor, a space marine loses the auto-senses that give him enhanced vision, a hearing, and environmental awareness. He loses the strength augmentation provided by the armor's servo motors. He loses the protection of ceramite plating that can shrug off bolter rounds and shrapnel. He loses his Vox communicator, his Auspex, his mag-locked grenades, and every other piece of equipment that normally makes him a self-contained weapons platform. What he retains is still formidable: his gene seed enhanced strength and speed, his superior reflexes, his ability to see in low light conditions, his resistance to toxins and disease, his 2 hearts, and his Laramans cells. But these advantages, impressive as they are significantly diminished when the Marine is operating alone in hostile territory, potentially weakened by injury or prolonged captivity, and facing an enemy that numbers in the millions. An escaped space marine on an Ork-occupied world would need to master the art of guerrilla warfare, moving by night and hiding by day. She's scavenging food from the fungal growths that inevitably spring up wherever Orks have settled, and avoiding the patrols and roving mobs that crisscross Ork territory in a constant state of aggressive motion. He would need to find or improvise weapons, turning whatever materials are available into tools of survival and combat. A length of metal pipe becomes a club. A scavenged Ork blade, too crude for Astartes' standards but functional enough, becomes a makeshift sword. A discarded shuta, all recovered from a dead green skin and jury-rigged to fire despite its typically unreliable Ork construction, becomes a desperate ranged option, though using it risks drawing more attention than its limited stopping power can handle. The terrain itself presents challenges that vary depending on the type of world the Marine finds himself on. An Orc-occupied hive world might offer the advantage of extensive underground tunnel networks and abandoned infrastructure that could provide shelter and concealment. But it would also mean navigating through the dense, chaotic sprawl of an Orc-modified urban landscape, where crude fortifications, garbage dumps, and improvised structures have been built over and through the existing Imperial architecture in a bewildering maze of green skin engineering. An Orc-occupied agri-world might offer the advantage of open terrain and natural resources, but the flat, featureless landscape provides little cover, and the Orc speed freaks who patrol such worlds in their ramshackle vehicles can cover ground far faster than even an enhanced Astartes can run. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of escape is the simple fact that Orcs enjoy hunting. A runaway prisoner is not just a loss of property to the Orcs, he is an opportunity for sport. A manhunt, or in this case, a marine hunt, provides exactly the kind of entertainment that Orcs crave. A chance to chase a worthy opponent through interesting terrain, using all the tracking instincts and predatory skills that the green-skinned species possesses in abundance. Orc commandos, the stealthy specialists who are the closest thing the green-skinned species has to special forces operatives, are particularly well suited for tracking down escaped prisoners. And a space marine who thinks he has slipped away unnoticed might find himself being stalked by creatures far more cunning and patient than their boisterous cousins. The Imperium does not take kindly to space marines who allow themselves to be captured. While the specific response varies by chapter, many regard capture as a form of failure that reflects poorly not just on the individual Marine, but on the chapter as a whole. A returned captive might be subjected to extensive interrogation by the chaplains and librarians of his chapter, who will probe his mind for any sign of corruption, indoctrination, or compromised loyalty. He may be required to undergo a period of penance, performing acts of contrition and self-mortification to atone for the perceived shame of his capture. In extreme cases, particularly if there is any suspicion that the Marine was mentally or physically compromised during his captivity, he might be assigned to a penitent crusade, a one-way mission of redemption from which he is not expected to return. Now let us examine some specific incidents and historical accounts that illuminate the broader patterns we have been discussing. Because the lore of Warhammer 40,000 is rich with examples that demonstrate just how terrifying and varied the Orc threat can be, and how it has intersected with the Adeptus Astartes throughout the long history of the Imperium. The War of the Beast, which took place in the 32nd Millennium, roughly 1,500 years after the Horus Heresy, stands as perhaps the most significant and terrifying demonstration of what the Orcs are capable of when they are truly united and operating at their full potential. The war boss, known only as the Beast, managed something that no other Orc leader had achieved before or has achieved since. He united a massive portion of the Orc race under a single banner and turned them into a cohesive fighting force that used actual battlefield tactics, strategic planning, and even diplomacy. This was not the usual green horde rushing headlong into battle with reckless abandon. This was something far more dangerous. An organized Orc empire with a level of technological sophistication that rivaled and in some areas exceeded that of the Imperium itself. During the War of the Beast, the Orks deployed attack moons, essentially planetoid-sized space stations, equipped with gravity weapons, capable of devastating entire worlds. They demonstrated the ability to construct teleportation networks that could move armies across interstellar distances. And the Beast himself was a being of such extraordinary physical and intellectual capability that he stood roughly 10 meters tall, encased in a massive suit of mega armor, and could speak fluent High Gothic, the formal language of the Imperium. The fact that an Ork could speak the Emperor's own tongue with perfect clarity was, to many Imperial scholars, more terrifying than all the gravity weapons and attack moons combined, because it demonstrated that the Ork species contained within it a potential for intelligence and sophistication that the Imperium had consistently and dangerously underestimated. The War of the Beast saw entire Space Marine chapters wiped out. The Imperial Fists stood one of the most venerable and respected chapters in the entire Imperium, were slaughtered almost to a man, with only a handful of survivors. The conflict was so devastating that it ultimately led to the creation of the Death Watch, the specialized chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos that draws veteran Space Marines from every chapter to form elite kill teams specifically designed to combat alien threats. The fact that the Imperium's response to the Beast required the invention of an entirely new type of military organization tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the threat was taken. During this conflict, the Orks demonstrated an approach to captured prisoners that was far more organized and purposeful than the usual Ork treatment of captives. The Beast's forces were documented breeding captured human populations as livestock, at maintaining vast prisoner camps where humans were systematically processed for food, labor, and other purposes that the surviving Imperial records describe only in the most general terms. The implication, though never explicitly stated in the sources, is that the Beast's pain boys were conducting experiments on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before, using the vast populations of captured humans as raw material for biological research aimed at further enhancing the already formidable Ork species. The siege of Hell's Reach on the world of Armageddon provides another relevant example, though from a different angle. During the Third War for Armageddon, Reclusiarch Grimaldus of the Black Templars led the defense of Hive Hell's Reach against a massive Ork invasion led by the infamous war boss Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka. The fighting in and around the Hive City was some of the most brutal in the entire war, with Space Marines, Imperial Guard, and civilian militia fighting side by side against an Ork horde that vastly outnumbered them. During this campaign, the Orks overran numerous defensive positions, and the fate of those defenders who were unable to retreat or die fighting is left deliberately vague in most accounts, a silence that speaks volumes about what likely happened to them. Should consider for a moment the scale of what happened on Armageddon. This was not a single battle, but an entire war that raged across an entire planet for years. Billions of humans lived on Armageddon, and when the Orks came, those billions were suddenly thrust into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The industrial hive cities, which had once produced the weapons and munitions that fueled the Imperium's endless wars, or were converted into Ork workshops where captured humans were forced to labor alongside Gretchen, producing crude but effective war material for the Green Tide's war machine. The vast ash wastes between the hives became hunting grounds where Ork speed freaks raced their ramshackle vehicles, using fleeing human refugees as both obstacles and targets. And in the ruins of overrun military positions, Ork painboys set up their crude operating theaters, working their way through the accumulated wounded and captured with the methodical enthusiasm of children given a new set of building blocks. The Space Marines who fought on Armageddon witnessed these horrors firsthand, and the experience left marks that went beyond physical scars. Chaplains of multiple chapters reported increased requests for spiritual guidance from Marines who had served on Armageddon, but particularly those who had been forced to leave wounded comrades behind during retreats from overrun positions. The knowledge that those comrades were likely still alive, still suffering in the hands of Ork captors, created a kind of survivor's guilt that was particularly difficult to address through conventional Astartes' psychological support methods. The Third War for Armageddon itself is instructive in understanding how Orks treat conquered territory and its inhabitants. After their initial victories, the Orks established control over vast swathes of Armageddon's surface, enslaving the human population and putting them to work in support of the ongoing war effort. Human slaves were forced to work in Ork factories, producing ammunition and weapons under the brutal supervision of runthurds. Those who faltered were beaten, and those who could no longer work were disposed of in whatever manner the Orks found most convenient or entertaining. So the conditions in these slave camps were, by all accounts, beyond anything that even the most cynical imperial citizen would consider acceptable, which is saying something given the generally grim standards of life in the 41st millennium. Gazgkul Thraka himself is a fascinating figure in the context of our discussion, because his personal history illustrates the terrifying potential of Ork painboy medicine. Gazgkul began his career as a relatively unremarkable Ork warrior, just a Goth clan boy who showed some promise but was by no means destined for greatness. Then he suffered a devastating head injury that shattered his skull and should have killed him outright. Instead, he was taken to a pain boy named Grotznik, one of the most infamous mad docs in Ork history, who replaced Gazgkul's damaged skull with a bionic augmentation of his own design. When Gazgkul awoke from this procedure, he claimed to have received visions from the Ork gods Gork and Mork, and visions that would eventually drive him to become the most powerful and dangerous war boss in the galaxy. Let that sink in for a moment. An Ork pain boy, working with crude tools and instinctive knowledge, performed brain surgery on a critically wounded warrior. And the result was not just survival, but the creation of the single greatest military threat to the Imperium from the Ork species in the entire 41st millennium. Gazgkul went on to launch 2 massive invasions of Armageddon, and to unite Ork forces across multiple sectors, and to become the focal point of the greatest Green Tide crusade the galaxy has seen since the War of the Beast. All because one pain boy had the skill or the luck, or perhaps the psychic backing of the Gestalt field, to make a crude brain augmentation work in exactly the right way. The idea that an Ork pain boy's crude surgery could produce a result this significant should give you serious pause when you consider what those same pain boys might be capable of if they ever successfully reverse-engineered Space Marine gene seed. The enhancement of a single Ork brain created a galactic-level threat. What might the enhancement of an entire Ork species produce? The Rin's World campaign provides yet another perspective on the interaction between Orks and Space Marines. When the Ork war boss Snagrod invaded Rin's World, the homeworld of the Crimson Fist's Space Marine chapter, the ensuing conflict saw the near-total destruction of the chapter. A catastrophic malfunction in the chapter's own missile defense system destroyed their fortress monastery, killing a significant portion of their strength in a single devastating instant. The surviving Crimson Fists found themselves fighting a desperate guerrilla war across their own homeworld, outnumbered thousands to one by an Ork horde that had already conquered most of the planet's surface. During this campaign, the Orks enslaved the majority of the planet's human population, putting them to work in the crude industries that sprang up wherever the green tide settled. The Crimson Fists, who survived the initial catastrophe, fought with the fury of Marines, who had nothing left to lose. But the possibility of capture was a constant threat, particularly for the small, isolated groups of Marines who were operating deep behind Ork lines, cut off from resupply and reinforcement. The records of this campaign make reference to several instances where wounded Marines were left behind during retreats, their ultimate fates unknown. Whether any of these Marines were captured alive, and if so, what became of them, is a question that the official histories choose not to address. Another of those telling silences that speak louder than words. The Death Watch, that elite formation of Space Marines, drawn from multiple chapters to serve as the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, has perhaps the most extensive institutional knowledge of what happens to captured Astartes. Death Watch kill teams often operate deep behind enemy lines, conducting covert missions in territory controlled by the Orks and other Xenos species. These missions sometimes include rescue operations to recover captured Imperial personnel, and the intelligence gathered during these operations has contributed to the Imperium's understanding of how different Xenos species treat their prisoners. According to Death Watch intelligence reports, the treatment of captured Space Marines varies significantly, depending on which Ork clan holds them. The Goths, the most numerous and aggressive of the major Ork clans, tend to be the least interested in keeping prisoners alive. They prefer to kill their enemies in battle and regard the idea of keeping prisoners as somewhat un-Orky. A Goth mob that captures a Space Marine is more likely to beat him to death on the spot than to bring him back to camp alive, because the Goths are purists when it comes to combat. They want the satisfaction of killing their enemies with their own hands in the heat of battle, and anything that happens after the battle is over is considered a poor substitute for the real thing. This does not mean that a Space Marine captured by Goths is guaranteed a quick death, only that his captivity is unlikely to be prolonged. The Goths will get their fun out of him and move on. The evil sons, who are obsessed with speed and vehicles, might keep a captured Marine alive long enough for a mech to study his power armor's systems, but are unlikely to maintain a long-term captive. The evil sons are interested in making things go faster. And while a suit of power armor contains some fascinating technology, the evil sons' mech boys are primarily focused on engines, wheels, and things that make loud noises when you stomp on the accelerator. A captured space marine might find himself strapped to the front of a war truck as a hood ornament, or used as a test dummy in some insane mech's attempts to build a faster vehicle. The evil sons appreciate the spectacle of speed and destruction, and a space marine, even a captured and helpless one, can contribute to that spectacle in ways that the Orks find endlessly entertaining. The Bad Moons, the wealthiest of the Ork clans, thanks to their teeth growing faster than those of any other clan, are perhaps the most likely to keep a space marine alive as a status symbol. Bad Moon knobs are obsessed with displaying their wealth and power, and owning a captured beaky is about as prestigious as it gets in Orc society. A Bad Moon. Nob might keep a captured marine chained up in his camp as a trophy, showing him off to visiting dignitaries and rivals as proof of his prowess in battle. The marine would be kept alive and in reasonably good condition, not out of any concern for his welfare, but because a dead trophy is significantly less impressive than a living one. This kind of captivity might be the least physically brutal of the options available, but the psychological toll of being reduced to a display piece, a living ornament for an Orc knobs collection, is its own particular form of torture. The Death Skulls, who are notorious looters and scavengers, are more likely to strip a marine of his equipment and then pass the now naked Astartes on to whoever wants him, whether that is a pain boy, a fighting pit operator, or a run-third looking for a particularly impressive slave. Death Skull mech boys are the most prolific looters in all of Orc society, and they will take everything that is not nailed down, and a fair amount that is. A Space Marine's armor, weapons, and equipment would be divided up among the mob's mech boys and knobs with the speed and efficiency of vultures descending on a carcass. Each piece of kit argued over, traded, and eventually incorporated into whatever project the new owner happens to be working on at the time. The Marine himself, stripped of everything that made him an Astartes in the physical sense, would be reduced to his bare, gene seed-enhanced body, which is still valuable, but in a much more limited way than the full package. The Blood Axes, as we discussed earlier, are the most likely to make long-term use of a captured space marine. Their familiarity with human society and their willingness to engage in trade and diplomacy means they understand the value of an Astartes as both a source of intelligence and a bargaining chip. And a Blood Axe war boss might keep a captured space marine alive for years, using him as an advisor on human tactics and technology, a translator during negotiations with Imperial forces, or simply as a prestigious trophy that demonstrates the war boss's power and cunning to his rivals. And then there are the freebooters, the Orc equivalent of pirates, who operate outside the normal clan structure and answer to no one but their own captains. Freebooter crews are known for taking prisoners of any species and using them in whatever way seems most profitable at the moment. Some freebooter captains maintain fighting pits aboard their ships, offering gladiatorial entertainment to their crews during long voyages between raids. Others sell their prisoners to the highest bidder, and a space marine would fetch a considerable price from a pain boy or mech willing to pay for such a rare and valuable specimen. The broader implications of Orc captivity extend beyond the fate of individual space marines. Every Astartes carries within him the gene seed of his chapter, the genetic legacy of his Primarch, the biological heritage that connects him to the Emperor's original vision for the defenders of humanity. When a space marine is captured by the Orks, that gene seed is placed at risk. If a pain boy successfully extracts a marine's progenoid glands, and even if he does not understand what they are or how they work, the genetic material they contain could potentially be lost forever, denied to the chapter that needs it to create the next generation of warriors. The Adeptus Mechanicus has long theorized that the Ork Gestalt psychic field might be capable of interacting with gene seed in unpredictable and potentially catastrophic ways. If enough Orks believed that gene seed could be used to make them stronger, the psychic field might actually make it possible, at least partially. This is a nightmare scenario that keeps the most senior members of the Ordo Xenos awake at night, because it suggests that the barrier between Ork biology and Astartes biology, which should be absolute, might be permeable under the right conditions. The creation of even a single Ork with Astartes-level enhancements could trigger a cascade of biological evolution across the entire Ork species, potentially producing a new generation of greenskins that combined Ork resilience and aggression with Astartes' speed, strength, and intelligence. This fear is not entirely theoretical. The War of the Beast demonstrated that the Ork species contains within it the potential for rapid and dramatic evolutionary advancement. The Prime Orks, who commanded the Beast's forces, were beings of extraordinary physical and mental capability, larger than war bosses, smarter than most humans, and possessed of power armor-like biological structures that grew naturally from their own bodies. The Adeptus Mechanicus speculated that this growth represented a latent evolutionary stage that was triggered when the Ork species reached a critical mass of population and psychic energy. If gene seed could serve as a catalyst for further evolution along these lines, the consequences would be apocalyptic. Consider the implications carefully. The gene seed was designed by the Emperor of mankind, yet one of the most powerful psychers who has ever lived, to transform ordinary humans into superhuman warriors. It contains genetic information of incredible complexity, biological blueprints for organs that enhance strength, speed, resilience, senses, and cognitive function far beyond the baseline human norm. Now imagine that genetic information being fed into the Ork's psychic field, interpreted through the instinctive biological knowledge of a pain boy, and amplified by the collective belief of millions of Orks who genuinely think that whatever their doc is doing will make them bigger and tougher. The result might not resemble the original gene seed organs at all, but it might produce something new, something that combines elements of Astartes' enhancement with the already formidable Ork physiology in ways that neither species could have achieved on its own. And the creation of even a handful of such hybrid organisms could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy, tipping the scales in favor of the Ork species in ways that the Imperium might not be able to counter. This is why the Death Watch treats the recovery of gene seed from Ork-held territory as a priority that supersedes almost every other consideration. Should a Death Watch kill team will accept mission parameters that border on suicidal if the objective is to recover or destroy gene seed that has fallen into Ork hands. The risk is simply too great to leave such material in the possession of a species that might, through sheer belief and biological instinct, find a way to use it. Let us take a moment to consider the recovery of Space Marines who do manage to return from Ork captivity. because their experiences illuminate aspects of the Ork threat that might otherwise remain hidden. Returned captives have provided the Imperium with invaluable intelligence about Ork society, technology, and biology. Intelligence that has been used to develop new tactics, weapons, and strategies for fighting the Green Menace. But this intelligence comes at a terrible cost, both to the individual Marine and to the chapter he serves. Yet a Space Marine who returns from Ork captivity is a changed being. The physical damage can usually be repaired by the chapter's apothecaries, though severe cases may require augmetic replacement of lost or damaged limbs and organs. The psychological damage is harder to address. Many returned captives exhibit symptoms that would be recognizable to any Imperial physician as a form of profound trauma, including hypervigilance, emotional withdrawal, or difficulty reintegrating with their battle brothers, and in extreme cases, violent episodes triggered by stimuli that remind them of their captivity. The chaplains and librarians of the chapter do their best to address these issues through prayer, meditation, psychic intervention, and the reassertion of the conditioning that forms the bedrock of an Astarte's psychological architecture. But some Marines never fully recover, and they carry the scars of their captivity with them for the rest of their service, invisible wounds that no apothecary can heal and no amount of training can erase. The information that returned captives provide about Ork pain boy techniques has been particularly valuable to the Imperium's understanding of Orkoid biology. By studying the crude procedures that were performed on them, Imperial scholars have gained insights into the Ork approach to surgery, bionics, and biological augmentation that would have been difficult or impossible to obtain through any other means. This information has been used to develop countermeasures against specific Ork biological capabilities, to improve the treatment of wounds inflicted by Ork weapons, and to better understand the vulnerabilities of the Orkoid species. But perhaps the most important thing that returned captives bring back with them is perspective. A Space Marine who has experienced Ork captivity firsthand has an understanding of the Ork threat that no amount of theoretical study can provide. He has seen the creativity and the cruelty of the Orks up close, has experienced their unpredictable and often bizarrely innovative approach to violence and technology, and has learned that underestimating the Orks is a mistake that can cost not just one life, but millions. This perspective makes returned captives invaluable as trainers and advisors, who are capable of preparing their battle brothers for the realities of fighting the Orks in ways that conventional training cannot achieve. As we bring this journey to its close, I want you to sit with the full weight of what we have explored tonight. We have talked about the Pain Boys and their insatiable hunger for experimentation, their willingness to take apart a living Space Marine piece by piece just to satisfy their curiosity about what makes him tick. We have talked about the fighting pits, where the Emperor's finest warriors are reduced to gladiators, forced to kill for the amusement of creatures that regard violence as the highest form of entertainment. We have talked about the Mech Boys and their relentless drive to loot and repurpose everything they encounter, including living prisoners who are reduced to biological components in ramshackle Ork war machines. We have talked about the slow, grinding horror of slavery, the psychological assault of isolation and powerlessness, and the terrible fear that the Orks might one day unlock the secrets of gene seed and use them to create something even more terrifying than the green tide that already threatens to overwhelm the galaxy. There is a lesson in all of this, and it is one that the Imperium has been learning and relearning for 10,000 years. The Orks are not a problem that can be solved. They are not an enemy that can be defeated in any permanent sense. They are a condition, a permanent feature of the galactic landscape, as inescapable and as enduring as the stars themselves. You can beat them on 1,000 battlefields, and they will come back on 1,000 more, growing back from their spores like weeds in a garden that can never be fully cleared. And for every world that the Imperium successfully defends against an Ork invasion, there are others that fall, their populations enslaved, their resources looted, their defenders scattered or captured or killed in ways that the official histories prefer not to describe in detail. The captured Space Marine represents the ultimate expression of this relentless threat. He is the proof that even the mightiest warriors humanity has ever produced are not immune to the green tide's hunger. He is the evidence that the Orks, for all their apparent stupidity and their crude technology and their childlike love of violence, are capable of bringing low beings that were designed by the Emperor himself to be invincible. And he is a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the greatest danger is not always the most sophisticated or the most powerful enemy. Sometimes it is the most persistent, the most numerous, and the most brutally creative. There is something deeply unsettling about the way the Orks approach captivity, and it has to do with the absence of malice in the traditional sense. When chaos tortures a prisoner, there is intention behind it, a desire to corrupt, to break, to claim a soul for the dark gods. When the Dark Eldar torture a prisoner, there is a need driving it, a hunger for the suffering that sustains their wretched existence. But when the Orks subject a captured Space Marine to their various torments, there is no grand design, no cosmic purpose, no malicious intent in the way humans would understand it. The Pain Boy cuts open his prisoner not because he wants to cause suffering, but because he is genuinely curious about what is inside. The fighting pit operator forces his captives to battle not because he enjoys cruelty, but because he genuinely cannot understand why anyone would not want to fight. The Mech Boy incorporates a living prisoner into his latest creation not out of sadism, but because the prisoner happened to be the right size and shape for the component he needed. This absence of intentional evil makes the Ork treatment of captives somehow worse than it would be if it were motivated by hatred or malice. You cannot reason with a being that is not choosing to be cruel. You cannot appeal to the mercy of a creature that does not understand the concept. You cannot negotiate with an intelligence that regards your suffering as just another interesting phenomenon to be observed and, if possible, replicated in larger quantities. The Ork is not your enemy in the personal sense. He does not hate you. He does not want to destroy you because of what you represent or what you believe. He simply wants to use you in whatever way seems most fun or interesting at the time, and when you are used up, he will discard you without a second thought and move on to the next shiny thing that catches his eye. For a Space Marine who has been trained to face enemies with purpose and conviction, this purposeless cruelty is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Ork captivity to endure. You cannot marshal your will against an enemy who is not trying to break your will. You cannot maintain your defiance against a captor who does not care whether you are defiant or submissive. Yet you cannot find meaning in your suffering when your suffering has no meaning to the one inflicting it. All you can do is endure, moment by moment, holding on to whatever scraps of identity and purpose you can salvage from the wreckage of your former existence, and hoping that somewhere, somehow, the Emperor's mercy will find you before the last of your strength gives out. But I also want you to remember something else. Something that speaks to the enduring strength of the human spirit, and even in its most enhanced and augmented form. The fact that Space Marines can endure these horrors, that some of them survive and return to their chapters, that the knowledge they bring back makes the Imperium stronger and better prepared to face the Ork threat. That is a testament to the power of the Emperor's work. The gene seed was designed to create warriors who could endure anything the galaxy threw at them. And while the Emperor may not have envisioned the specific horrors of Ork captivity, the resilience he built into his finest creations has proven sufficient to carry at least some of them through to the other side. The galaxy is a dark and terrible place, and the threats that assail humanity from every direction seem to grow more numerous and more dangerous with every passing century. The Orks are not the most sophisticated of these threats, nor the most insidious, nor the most alien. Yea, but they may be the most relentless, the most numerous, and in their own crude and brutal way, the most adaptable. And for any Space Marine who finds himself on the wrong end of an Ork battle line, separated from his brothers and cut off from retreat, the Orks represent something that no amount of gene seed enhancement or psycho-conditioning can fully prepare him for. A fate where death would be a mercy, yet a fate where the very enhancements that make him the Emperor's finest weapon become the instruments of his prolonged suffering. A fate that the Imperium does not speak of, that the chapters do not acknowledge, that is hidden away in classified Death Watch intelligence reports, and the haunted eyes of the rare few who have lived through it and returned to tell the tale. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And for those warriors who fall into the hands of the Orks, as that war becomes something personal, something intimate, something that follows them into the darkness of captivity and stays with them long after the fighting ends. It is a reminder that in a galaxy full of horrors, some of the worst are not the grand cosmic threats that shake the foundations of reality, but the small, brutal, everyday cruelties that one species can inflict upon another simply because it can. And on that note, if you found this exploration as fascinating and unsettling as I found researching it, do me a favor and hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and ring that bell so you do not miss our next dive into the darkest corners of the 41st Millennium. Your support means the world to me, and it helps bring more of these deep dives to your screen. Until next time, stay safe out there. And if you hear the sound of heavy boots and guttural laughter echoing through the smoke of a battlefield, do yourself a favor. Save the last bolt for yourself. The Emperor protects, but some things even he cannot undo.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.